Hey y'all, welcome to today's show. Today we will wrap up the first of the Ten Commandments. We're going to get into a very interesting topic, but before we do that, of course, we're going to start with a few questions and answers from radio replies. And this is pretty common. You're going to, anytime you interact with people that have a bias against the Catholic Church, you're going to find these arguments pretty much repeated. And, I'm reading from a book from the 30s through 40s. So these are old, tired arguments that have been answered a million times. But I think the fathers Rumble and Carty did a particularly good job. The person says, "We Protestants believe that Christian doctrine was kept pure as long as the apostles lived, but after their deaths errors crept in." And they answer, "You err both in fact and doctrine. In fact, the apostles complained of errors not of the church, but of individual professing Christians even in their own days. In doctrine, because you practically assert that Christ failed to preserve his church, that the Holy Spirit did not remain with her, and that the gates of hell did prevail against her. In other words, your doctrine is that Christ could not do what he said he would do. No, individuals in all ages have fallen into error insofar as they departed from the teachings of the church. And in falling into error, they have fallen out of the church, even as Protestant reformers did themselves." As I've mentioned many times, it was reading the early church fathers in large part that led me to Catholicism. First of all, it was learning that Protestant doctrine didn't match with the Bible. The more I learned of Protestant doctrine, the more I realized it was fallacious. It was against the very words of Christ. You don't believe me? Well, the other night, a girl got in touch on Twitter, someone who is considering converting to Catholicism, and said, "Give me one example of where Protestant doctrine is false and Catholic doctrine is true." And I said, well, this is pretty darn obvious, actually. In all four Gospels, Jesus forbade divorce. Every Protestant denomination allows divorce, yet they say they take the Bible as their sole authority. They do the opposite of what Jesus said. And we went through it, and she said, "Well, but what about putting away your wife?" And I said, well, that's separation. Separation is allowed, but Jesus said specifically they were not allowed to remarry. He said anyone who separates from his wife and marries another commits adultery, and that he would cause her to commit adultery and all that. Absolutely forbidden, not allowed. And we talked about annulment, and I've done a whole show on annulments and the difference between annulment and divorce. And she had to come to the conclusion that you're right. All 50,000 Protestant denominations, and to a large extent, the Orthodox churches practice a false doctrine, a doctrine that does not agree with the words of very plain words of Jesus Christ. Only the Catholic Church remains true to his teachings. But anyway, that's real simple. Now, if Protestants would take the time to read the early Christian writings, starting with the Didache, then Pope St. Clement of Rome, the third pope, who was actually ordained by St. Peter, St. Ignatius, Polycarp, Justin Martyr, Barnabas, even though that's not a book that's ever been officially affirmed as being written by the Barnabas of the Bible, Paul's protege, St. Paul's protege. The voice of it is very much what you would call Pauline. It is very much in the voice and rhetoric of St. Paul. And the early Christians, in the 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries, believed it was written by St. Barnabas. So you always have to get that little caveat. But those are the earliest Christian writings outside of the Bible itself. And you will see that, especially when they address the Gnostic heresies and such, it took almost 400 years for the church to produce a Bible. Jesus left us a church, not a Bible. But you will see during the first first century, second century, third century, that the early Christians were extremely rigorous in defending the teachings passed on to them by the apostles. Incredibly orthodox, and the church of 100 AD, 200 AD, 300 AD, all long before we had a Bible, is exactly the same as the Catholic Church is today. Same practices, same doctrines. Now, doctrines develop over time, but same basic teachings as you will find in the Bible, and the same practice. Another thing, Protestants don't have is the Mass. They don't have the Eucharist. They don't believe in the role of the priest. They don't believe in the sacraments, marriage being one of them. The Catholic Church still does, as is taught in the Bible, and was practiced in the earliest years of Christianity, the very first years of Christianity. I mean, you got to remember, St. John lived, well, he was the only one not martyred, and he lived to be very, very old. And he was there. I mean, he was communicating with these early bishops of the Catholic Church that are Christian writers. They were sending letters back and forth. The Blessed Virgin Mary was receiving and sending letters written on her behalf. I guess she would. I don't know that anything was actually written in her hand. I believe they were more like dictated. So yeah, we know exactly what the church actually is. And of course, all this is in my book, Confirmation, Autobiography of Faith. But you have to be willing to read a book. The young lady I spoke with the other night said that she didn't really have the patience or attention span to read a book. As an author, I find that a great shame, and I recommended my podcast. I hope she'll listen to my podcast, but one never knows. All you can do is say a prayer for people and hope God works on their hearts. And speaking of the incredible actions of God, I hope you've thanked him for saving President Trump's life the other night. It was almost one of the greatest disasters to ever happen in this country, and I don't think people fully understand the gravity of it yet. What would have happened had that bullet hit his head instead of his ear? So that was a miracle. That was an absolute miracle. That was St. Michael the Archangel. That was his guardian angel. That was the very power of God. A lot of people have said that something in I cannot remember the exact source, but it was one of the apparitions of the Blessed Mother. Was it Fatima? It could have been. Was on the very anniversary, and like this exact date and time as when that bullet went past his head, and they believe it was the Blessed Mother's intercession. It was absolutely a miracle. There's no way it wasn't a miracle. That is not coincidence. We saw a miracle with our own eyes, and God saved President Trump's life. And boy, if you're not motivated to get out and vote for Trump this year over the apostate Joe Biden, I don't know what I can tell you. I mean, because when God's on your side, you better figure out whose side you're on. If God's on his side and you're on the other side, you may be on the wrong side. Yeah. So anyway, let's get to the next question. The person says, it was the Catholic Church which early departed from the doctrines of Christ and thus forfeited the claim to be the true church. And of course they answer, if you think that by departing from the truth, the Catholic Church forfeited the claim to be the true church, then you believe that the infallible retention of the teachings of Christ must be a mark for the true church. Is your own church therefore infallible? Does it even claim to be? I admit that if the Catholic Church had failed in witnessing to the truth, she is not true, and I would at once leave her. But as this would mean that Christ was unable to keep his promise, I would also abandon belief in Christ. Certainly, wherever else I might go, I would not go to a Protestant church based on the doctrines of Christ that has failed to keep his promise. Person says, but you cannot tell me that the Catholic religion is carried out today in accordance with the quite simple teachings of Jesus. And they say Catholicity does not differ from what you call the simple teachings of Jesus, although they were not as simple as you suppose. However, the Catholic Church teaches all that Christ taught, whether his teaching was explicit or implicit. Essentially, she exists just as he would have her exist. There have been many secondary developments during the ages, but they were all foreseen and approved by Christ. After all, Christ established a living church, and a living church grows. He likened it to a seed. Even as a boy grows into a man with exactly the same personality, yet with many secondary changes in size, knowledge, and manners, so too has the church rightly developed. And this person has several more questions. We'll pick up on them next time. But they're getting into more specific doctrinal issues. And I'd like to move on to the last part of the first commandment. And it has to do with an interesting topic we don't really think about a whole lot anymore, well, at least outside of the Catholic Church. It's about what we call the extraordinary worship of God. That means taking oaths or making a vow to God. Of course, this is what Catholic religious do. I mean, when a monk, a nun, a priest, I mean, anybody who enters the religious service of the church takes a vow, makes an oath. Um, those are, of course, very formal. They're more informal ones. But I don't know that that's necessarily a concept that is retained in Protestantism, the idea of making vows or taking oaths, although when you take your marriage vows, you have just vowed to God to stay married to this person for life, never to cheat on him or her, to help them when they're sick or in health. I mean, obviously, Protestants don't put a lot of stock in vows, solemn vows taken before God. If they did, they couldn't believe in divorce. But I think most would still look at like testifying in the witness stand in court when you swear to tell the truth as a vow before God, and would be hesitant to commit perjury. Although Martin Luther certainly wouldn't have. He was quite big on perjury and lying. He wrote that he thought it was a real good thing if it was to suit his purposes. Well, anyway, Father Spirago in the Exhaustive Catechism says, we can moreover honor God by taking an oath or making a vow. To take an oath or make a vow is not an ordinary occurrence of our lives. It is only done in particular extraordinary cases. An oath is taken when human witnesses or when a human witness or asseveration is not sufficient. That would be like when you swear to tell the truth. A vow is made when we voluntarily pledge ourselves to do something for God. Another very good point. Marriage must always be voluntary. There is no valid marriage in which someone is forced into it. That's actually grounds for annulment. So an oath must be voluntary. You cannot force someone into an oath. We honor God by an oath because we thereby acknowledge his omnipotence, his justice, his holiness. And by a vow, we offer him a sacrifice because we bind ourselves by a solemn promise to perform a work pleasing to God. Under the topic of oaths, cases sometimes occur in which a man would not believe the word of another, but if a witness comes forward and affirms, that is so, I myself saw it, then the speaker is more readily believed, and all the more if the witness in question is known to be a man of honor. Now it may occur that a man calls God to witness, that is to say, that he appeals to omniscient God to make known the truth of what he has said by his almighty power. In this case, his word will be regarded as the word of God. As an official seal gives force to a decree, so the oath is a seal. God gives us to corroborate a statement. It is a coin of high value stamped with the name of the living God. Our Lord took an oath when Caiaphas adjured him by the living God to speak the truth. So did Esau when he confirmed an oath by the promise he made to relinquish his birthright for the pottage of lentils, which of course was the worst trade in history. I love lentils, but he could have grown a lot of lentils if he'd kept that land. To swear or take an oath is to call God to witness that one is speaking the truth, or that one will keep a promise. In swearing, a man calls either upon God or upon something he holds sacred. If a man swears by God, he makes use of words such as these, as the Lord liveth, in Jeremiah 4:2. As surely as there is a God in heaven, God is my witness, Romans 1:9. God may punish me, etc. Or we swear by holy things, such as the Holy Gospel, the cross of Christ, or the Blessed Sacrament. But as these things are incapable of attesting anything of themselves, or of punishing a deceiver, it is in fact the equivalent of calling God to witness. Our Lord himself speaks of swearing by the temple, by heaven, or by the throne of God in Matthew 23:21, 22. But to use such expressions as, upon my word, by my honor, as surely as I stand here, etc., is merely emphasizing an assertion and not swearing it. An oath may be simple or solemn. A simple oath is between a man in ordinary intercourse. A solemn oath is taken in the court of law or in the presence of an official personage. An oath is administered to soldiers and officers of the state. In taking a solemn oath, one is required to kiss the Holy Scriptures or a crucifix, and to say, "So help me God," to intimate that if he departs from the truth, he renounces the divine assistance and the blessings promised in the Gospels. Jews and Muslims have their own particular ceremonial. The latter raise one finger to show their belief in God. Now, you may know that in courts now, people have objected to swearing to tell the truth to God. They say, "I so affirm to tell the truth." That's I don't even know why that's admissible. It's admissible because the person is saying, "I swear to tell the truth by my own veracity as an honest person." That's not exactly an oath before God, and that's a very good example of how our laws that were once based upon Christian teaching have become thoroughly secular and have very little foundation in anything. And we don't have honest judges. We certainly don't have honest lawyers. And, you know, what is perjury now? If you're not swearing to God to tell the truth, you're just saying, "Believe me because I promise I'm an honest man." Um, yeah, that's not really got a lot of weight behind it. I don't care who you are. Believe it or not, attorneys, lawyers swear to uphold the truth, not to lie knowingly in court, and they lie all the time. You won't find a bigger liar than a lawyer, and the best liars become the most successful lawyers, and they usually become judges. So, what is our law really based on, honestly? All right. So anyway, you could say it's based on the British tradition. Well, how good is that, right? Uh, that all kind of changed. I mean, look at the execution of St. Thomas More, the greatest attorney of England, because he would not accept secular authority over the authority of God. All right, so Christians are not obliged to refuse to take an oath, for it is permitted to God and pleasing in his sight. If swearing were forbidden, Christ would not have made use of an oath in Matthew 26:64, nor would God have sworn to Abraham on Mount Moriah that he would multiply his seed as the stars of heaven and the sands of the seashore, Genesis 22:16, nor would St. Paul so frequently have taken God to witness in his epistles, such as Romans 1:9 and 2 Corinthians 1:23. The oath has beside it a good object. It serves to put an end to disputes, such as in Hebrews 6:16. It is pleasing to God because by it we make a public profession of faith in his omnipotence, his justice, his omniscience, and thus we honor him. On this account, atheists and social democrats, remember this is written in the 1890s, he's already talking about social democrats, cannot be induced to take an oath. In other words, you cannot believe anything an atheist or a socialist, social democrat, or just call him a Democrat these days, says, because they are liars. Such as, Joe Biden. There's a real good example. Uh, you know, no police officers were killed on January 6th. Two protesters were killed by the police. One innocent woman shot in the head, and another one essentially kicked and beaten to death as she begged for help. Joe Biden doesn't say that, does he? Donald Trump never said that Klansmen and neo-Nazis were good people. Joe Biden keeps saying he did. Even Snopes and newsbusters, I mean, the most liberal left wing of fact checkers have had to say, what Joe Biden is saying is false. But he repeated it again on Lester Holt's show because he would love for Donald Trump to be shot in the head. And he's encouraging people to shoot at the president. You can't take his words any other way, unless you just want to assume that he's so mentally gone he doesn't know what he's doing. But I think he knows exactly what he's doing in that regard. Anyway, it is God's will that we confirm our word with an oath when necessary, such as in Exodus 22:11, where our Lord said, "Let your speech be yes or no. Let your speech be yea, no, no. And that which is over and above these is of evil," in Matthew 5:37. The modern translation lets your yes be yes and your no be no. That's why I'm getting confused. He meant to warn the Pharisees against the habit to which they were addicted of using idle, unnecessary oaths. Catholics need not refuse to take an oath, as some sectaries do, some sects, some Protestants. However, no one ought to be compelled to do so. Anyone who forces a man to swear when he knows he will swear falsely is in some way worse than a murderer. For the murderer only kills the body, where he who makes another swear falsely causes the death of the soul. nay, of two souls, his neighbor's soul and his own, for he is responsible for the other's death. That's pretty heavy right there. I had not thought of it that way, but yes, that is true. We ought therefore to make use of an oath only when it is absolutely necessary, with deliberation, and in the interest of truth and justice. When Christ says the oath is of evil in Matthew 5:37, he intends to signify that it is occasioned by man's evil tendencies and that rash oaths are sinful. Had mankind not fallen from its original state of integrity and justice, there would have been no need for an oath. But since faith and fidelity have vanished, recourse has been had to it. Not until evil prevailed everywhere did swearing become an ordinary practice. When by reason of the general perfidy and corruption no man's word could be relied on, then God was called to witness. St. Augustine compares the oath to a medicine which must not be taken without good reason. It is to a man's word what the crutch is to the cripple. Consequently, it is wrong to swear heedlessly about trifling matters, as salesmen often do when speaking about their wares. Frequent swearing is apt to lead to false swearing. A man that sweareth much shall be filled with iniquity, and a scourge shall not depart from his house. Ecclesiastes 23:12. Wherefore we must make use of oaths as seldom as possible, unless it is required of us by the government or in a court of law. Our oath must always be true. That is to say, when on our oath, we must always say what we really believe to be true, and we must have the intention of keeping our word. The Roman general Regulus in 250 BC affords a fine instance of this. He was taken a prisoner of war by the Carthaginians, and after being kept 6 years in captivity, he was sent to Rome to sue for peace. Before leaving the Carthaginian camp, a solemn oath was administered to him to return thither, provided the Romans would not conclude peace. On arriving in Rome, he informed the Senate of the enemy's weakness and urged them to pursue the war. He then returned to the prison, even though everyone in Rome, even the pagan high priest, spared no effort to detain him. St. Peter, on the contrary, swore falsely in the outer court of the high priest's palace, Matthew 26:72. He said he didn't know Jesus. Blessed Thomas More, the High Chancellor of England, was thrown into prison by Henry VIII because he would not concur in the hostile attitude that the monarch assumed toward the Catholic Church. He might have purchased his release by merely swearing to conform to what the sovereign decreed. He was advised to do this, mentally applying the word God, his supreme sovereign and Lord. So, in other words, in his mind, substituting God for the king, right? But he would not consent, saying he dared not swear falsely. It is possible, however, that one may swear under misapprehension, or one may be prevented by illness or misadventure or some other sufficient cause from fulfilling a promise made under an oath. In other words, you could be wrong. You could be saying what you think is true, but be wrong, or you could say, I will do this, and you could be prevented from doing it. That is, we must consider well beforehand whether our statement is strictly true, or whether we shall be able to accomplish our promise. King Herod at the feast swore rashly, for he promised with an oath to give the damsel who danced before him whatever she would ask. At her mother's instigation, she asked for the head of John the Baptist. Mark 6:23. We read that 40 Jews in their enmity to St. Paul swore neither to eat nor drink till they had killed him in Acts 23:12. In the present day, Freemasons bind themselves by oath not to express any desire to receive the last sacrament on their deathbed. Such oaths are sinful and highly displeasing to God. Never forget that Freemasonry is the absolute enemy of the Catholic Church and of Christianity in general. It is purely satanic. And, it's really interesting. We've got like the Waldensians and other Protestant groups that came from Europe here in North Carolina. And they... And I think the Anabaptists, a couple others would probably fall into this category. They don't really explain why the kings of like Italy and France and whatever countries they were kicked out of didn't want them there and called them treasonous. Well, they said that they couldn't swear any oath, and that meant they couldn't do military service. They had no loyalty to the king. They couldn't write any contracts as far as buying or selling property, that all marriage vows were invalidated. And, of course, the kings decided they were traitors and kicked them out of the country. They could have just put him in jail, but they were actually quite merciful as Catholic kings to do so. So anyway, we do need the Catholic Church to teach us what the words of Jesus mean, because a lot of people get them really wrong. Really, really wrong. Anyway, he says, he who swears falsely commits a grave act of blasphemy and draws down upon himself the curse of God and the penalty of eternal perdition. False swearing is also called perjury. He who swears falsely, who confirms by oath a statement he knows to be untrue, or who swears to do something, although he is conscious that he cannot fulfill his promise, is like a man who stamps a forged document with an official seal, an act which cannot escape punishment. Swearing falsely is a mortal sin, whatever be the subject of the oath. The curse of God rests upon the house of him who swears falsely. Zechariah 5:3. God often punishes false swearers by a speedy and sudden death. Not exactly sure how to pronounce this name. Sedecias. Anyway, he was the king of Judah, swore falsely to Nebuchadnezzar, another one I can have trouble with, and broke his covenant. Forthwith, God announced to him by the lips of the prophet Ezekiel that he should meet with severe chastisement and die in Babylon. That's Ezekiel 17. And in fact, Nebuchadnezzar, there's one extra vowel in that word, always throws me. Nebuchadnezzar took the king captive and put out his eyes and brought him to Babylon, where he died. 4 Kings 25:7. Vladislaus, see, I can actually pronounce that. Vladislaus, king of Hungary, concluded a peace with the Turkish Sultan Murad II and confirmed the treaty with an oath. Yet he resumed hostilities against him. He fell in the Battle of Warna in 1444 with all the flower of his nobility. Perjury is punishable by the law with imprisonment. The Emperor Charlemagne made it a law with that all who are convicted of swearing falsely should have their right hand cut off. Later on, 3 fingers only on the right hand, wherewith they took the oath, were struck off. Rash swearing is at least a venial sin. It is a bad habit, and he who is always ready to confirm every statement, whether true or false, by an oath, lives, if he knows the value of his words, in a state of mortal sin. If a man has sworn wrongfully, he must not keep his oath, but deplore it. That is what Herod ought to have done. With regard to breaking an oath, that is to say, the non-fulfillment of a promise made under an oath, it may be a venial or mortal sin, according to as the matter concerned is weighty or not. And the same is true of a vow. A vow is a solemn promise. A vow is a promise voluntarily made to God to perform some good action. The vow is a promise made to God. We call upon God implicitly, if not explicitly, when we say, "My God, I promise that I will do this or that." A simple intention is not a vow. No one, not even God himself, can require anything of us because of it, but just because of an intention. A vow is solemn. A vow is a promise made of our own free will. No one is bound to make it. Deuteronomy 23:22. And no one can be compelled to make it. A vow made under compulsion is invalid. Not so one made under apprehension of danger or stress of want, for then the act is voluntary. We must only promise what will be pleasing to God, not anything wrong, as did Jephthah, who before going to battle vowed to the Lord that if he was victorious he would offer as a holocaust whosoever should first come out of the door of his house. His only daughter came to meet him, and she was sacrificed. That's in Judges 11. Such a vow is foolish and displeasing to God, Ecclesiastes 5:3, and ought not to be accomplished. Usually something is promised which is not of obligation, a pilgrimage for instance, but one may also promise something which one is otherwise obliged to do. For instance, to observe fasts for the church, to keep the holy days, to be temperate in eating and drinking. In this case, failure to keep one's promise is a twofold sin. The owner of a factory whose only child was dangerously ill promised before God that if she recovered, that he would never have work done on Sundays and holy days. She got well, and he kept his word. He was then doubly bound to observe the holy days. Vows are sometimes accompanied by a condition, a kind of bargain made with God. Jacob promised to give tithes of his possessions to God if he brought him back prosperously to his father's house in Genesis 18:20 through 22. The procession on the rogation days originated through a vow made about the year 500 by St. Mamertus, Bishop of Vienna, in the time of a famine, and about a century later the procession on St. Mark's Day was instituted in consequence of a vow made by Pope Gregory the Great while plague was raging. The inhabitants of Oberammergau, I've never heard of this place. Anyway, they pledged themselves to perform the Passion Play every 10 years in 1633 at the time of an epidemic. St. Louis of France promised, if he recovered from a severe illness, to undertake a crusade in 1248. In the present day, many persons promise in illness or affliction to visit some place of pilgrimage, to make an offering to some church, to give a statue, to fast on certain days. The celebrated sanctuary of Maria Zell, which attracts so many pilgrims, is due to a vow made before the Battle of the Turks by King Louis I of Hungary in 1363. The most important vows are religious vows, that is to say, the solemn promise made voluntarily by persons entering into a religious order, to follow the evangelical counsels. Poverty, chastity, and obedience are the three vows taken by the religious. They are very useful, for by them a man entirely gives up the world in order to serve God better. These vows are most pleasing to God, for those who take them consecrate not only all they do, but their own selves to God. St. Anselm says, "He who gives the tree gives more than he who gives only the fruit of the tree." Many persons offer oblations to God, a vestment, for instance, candles or flowers, but a better, more perfect oblation is to give one's self to God. The vows of religion are either solemn, so called because the obligations incurred are greater, or simple vows. Solemn vows are those in which there is an irrevocable consecration of oneself accepted by the Church on the part of the one who takes them. What is consecrated to God can never again be employed for secular purposes. With that which is simply dedicated, it is otherwise. Thus, anyone who takes a solemn vows is irrevocably consecrated to the service of God. The Pope alone can release from solemn vows, and that only for weighty reasons. Before taking the solemn vows, i.e. being professed, it is necessary to have spent a year in the novitiate. I have trouble with that one too. Those extra syllables get me. And have been under the simple vows for at least 3 years. Bishops or the superior general of an order can generally release from the simple vows and for a less grave cause. A vow renders the good action which we pledge ourselves to perform more acceptable to God. Consequently, by means of a vow, we obtain a more speedy answer to prayer and make more rapid progress in the way of perfection. By a vow, we prove our fidelity to God, and we also make an offering to God because we thereby bind ourselves to the performance of a good work. Thus, for instance, one who fasts in fulfillment of a vow performs a more perfect action than he who fasts without a vow. Hence it is that the prayers of those who make vows are more speedily granted. After the inhabitants of Oberammergau had made the promise already mentioned, not one more fell victim to the pestilence. The pious Anna made a vow to the Lord when she prayed that a son might be granted to her, and she became mother of the great prophet Samuel in 1 Kings 1:11. Why do we see so many ex votos in place of pilgrimage, so many votive offerings in churches? Vows enable us to attain more quickly to perfection, according to St. Francis of Sales. We therefore gain strength in the practice of virtue because our will is fortified by the vow. The thought, "I have promised my God to do this," is a powerful incentive to performance of good actions. Many persons of great sanctity have taken vows as a useful restraint to keep themselves in fear of God. We may obtain special graces from God by pledging ourselves to make novenas in honor of the saints, or to be particularly devout to the Mother of God during the month of May or October, to perform certain mortifications or good works. He who does not keep a solemn promise offends against God, and so does he who needlessly postpones the fulfillment of the promise. If we are bound to keep our word to our fellow creatures, how much more ought we to fulfill promises made to God? It is much better not to vow than after a vow not to perform the things promised. Ecclesiastes 5:4. The debtor is compelled by the law of the land to pay his debt, and can it be supposed that he will go scot-free who withholds from God what is his due? The non-fulfillment of a vow may be either a venial or moral sin. It is according to the importance of the matter in question. The guilt is doubled if at the same time we transgress a command and show disrespect to God, as for instance by violating a vow of chastity. If we are unable to fulfill a promise, we are exempt from blame, provided we do our utmost to perform the thing promised. Therefore, anyone who is desirous of taking a vow ought to consider well beforehand whether he will be able to keep his word. A man who wishes to build first makes an estimate of cost to see whether he has the means to allow him to complete the structure. Luke 14:28. No one ought to make a promise for his whole life without first testing his ability to keep it. St. Francis de Sales made a vow of saying the rosary every day of his life. He often regretted having been so hasty in that promise. If in any serious matter it is advisable to consult an experienced priest. For this reason, the Church has made the rule that everyone who wishes to take the vows of religion should have a 12-month noviceship. During that time, he can make up his mind as to whether he has a real vocation to religious life. If he takes the vows without feeling certain about his vocation, he has only himself to blame. A religious who finds himself unable to keep his vows must apply to his superior to be released from them or have them commuted. Our Lord says to his apostles, "Whoever you shall loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." Matthew 18:18. Hence, the bishop or other superior is authorized to absolve from vows. The vow is usually commuted for some good work or that is more conducive to the spiritual well-being of the individual. There are 5 vows from which the Holy Father alone can dispense: the vow to enter a religious order, the vow of lifetime chastity, the vow to visit the tombs of the apostles in Rome, the vow to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, the holy places, or to Compostela, the tomb of St. James. Under certain circumstances, the bishop also has power to dispense from these vows, if they have been made conditionally under some measure of compulsion, without mature deliberation, or in ignorance of what they involved. In a time of jubilee, every confessor has power to commute vows for some good work of another nature. One may always do more than one has promised. God will not be displeased any more than an ordinary creditor if he was paid more than what is due to him. And that's going to wrap this one up. So, y'all, like I said, other than actually testifying on a witness stand, or when you sign up for military duty, or to be an officer of a court, or swearing in for, like, the president, we don't take many vows in the secular world anymore. And I don't think I think few Protestants and probably very few Catholics actually understand what vows and oaths are all about and what they mean. So, this is actually a very important topic, because if you swear rashly, you can be held accountable by God for doing so. And if you swear falsely, that's a very grave sin. And like I said, our courts, I think the witnesses are probably far more honest than the lawyers and judges, and God help them. Yeah, if you believe that attorneys are honest, you've probably never met an attorney. I know one in my entire life. Now, I know 2 really good ones. One was a constitutional law attorney. He was a great friend, and he was a real character. I don't know. I would not attest to his veracity, but I would attest to his good character. And a really good guy, funny, big, sloppy, just really intelligent guy. I liked him a lot, and he helped me out when I needed help. So, but I knew one attorney that was so scrupulously honest that no one really wanted to hire him. That's how honest he was. And when he wanted to run for governor, and basically everyone said, "You're too honest to be a politician," and they thought he was eccentric and weird because he was an honest man. So that ought to tell you something about it. Anyway, y'all, have a good one. Remember the words of St. Padre Pio: pray, hope, and don't worry. And I'll talk to you next time.